Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today, joining us in our very inspiring conversation we hope to be through today on, once again, EU diplomacy and global governance, this year focusing on decentering Europe in global governance. And I very much appreciate that our co-director of VICES is here to welcome the group to our today's discussion and to introduce us about VICES. Now, Bastiaan van Apeldoorn is co-director of VICES and is also professor of global political economy and geopolitics at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And he's at the same time as a senator in the Dutch parliament, in Senate. And this is where he is joining us from today. And thank you, Bastiaan, for taking the time this morning to welcome us to an inspiring discussion.
Thank you very much, Aslem. And thank you for letting me introduce this event and welcome you all on behalf of VICES, the VU Interdisciplinary Center on European Studies. I'm actually not in the Senate right now. I'm still at home because of COVID. We also have switched to partial online meetings in the Senate. I'm going to The Hague later on, but this morning I first have a Zoom or a Teams meeting with my parliamentary group. So it's also hybrid in the Senate nowadays. Yes, very much welcome at this webinar organized by Aslem and others, and we are very happy to host this. Let me just say a few words about VICES. We're actually a small but expanding research community within the Vrije Universiteit of scholars working within the area of European studies broadly defined. And our aim is to really strengthen and raise the profile of the research done at the Vrije Universiteit within the area of European studies, and to also create a network of researchers working within this field, both within the university and beyond. And hereby we really try to be interdisciplinary because VICES is a joint undertaking of two faculties, the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Faculty of Law. And so I'm one of the two co-directors, and the other co-director is Gareth Davies, who is Professor of European Law at the Law Faculty at our university. So we try to strengthen and add to this field of European studies within VICES by offering a distinctive and refreshing perspective on this field and trying to really cover the different aspects, both internal, looking at the European democracy, rule of law, phenomena like the rise of populism and its impact upon European politics, but certainly also looking at, which is also today's focus, at the external dimension of European integration, which arguably is becoming ever more important. So we have had discussions and also academic literature about the role of the EU on the global stage, the activeness of the EU for a long time. I remember when I was still teaching European integration, EU governance in our department, that was already one of the topics, and there were textbooks about it. But for a long time, beyond trade policy, this idea of global activeness was above all an academic discussion, I think. But it's starting to become more real, and you also see the discourse shifting, and the EU is increasingly playing a role and also sort of discovering itself as a potential geopolitical actor. And with the rise of China and increasing geopolitical turbulence in the world, I think this only becomes a much more important topic than it already was. So I'm very happy that we can host this webinar on EU diplomacy in global governance, which is the second seminar of this type that Aslem and others are actually organizing. And there's absolutely an excellent lineup of speakers, real experts in this field. So very happy that we were able to to host this, and that this has been organized by you, Aslam. So unfortunately, I have to leave and actually join another Zoom or Teams meeting with the Dutch Senate, and then leave for The Hague later on. So I wish I could be there because it's a very interesting program, but I wish you very productive discussions, and I'm sure it will be a success. So with this introduction, again, very much welcome to all participants and panelists. I'll give the floor back to Aslam.
Thank you, Bastian, and thank you on your behalf. Thanks to VICES for making this webinar and hosting this webinar and making it possible. I also would like to acknowledge the efforts of actually my colleagues, John Hagen and Hortense Jongen, together also with Erik Sesne, in organizing, coming up with speakers' names, crafting the program, getting in touch with all of our speakers and such. So this has been a collective effort that I very much enjoyed. And yes, so thank you all for helping us organize this. So without further ado, I would like to now give the floor to Pinar, but before giving the floor to her, I would also like to put her presentation into a wider context for her, mainly because our students are actually quite familiar with her. And this is what I promised that I would be telling her in detail before she starts talking to our audience. And I would say probably it might have been also there before I joined the department, but the first time that we had with me teaching Pinar's work at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam was when we were teaching together with Marijn. Also, thank you for joining here, Marijn, this course on international security, and we had decided to adopt this critical security approach in the course. And Marijn, as a course coordinator, then had asked me whether I would actually like to talk about non-Western theory, and there I had come up with these suggestions, suggested readings of works with Pinar, Beribuzan, also Amitav Acharya, and we had started with this non-Western IR theory debate. And our students did then these readings on why there is no non-Western IR theory, but also going beyond the West in the thinking of IR, the works by Pinar. And this has always been a discussion that was very much welcomed by our students. And I'm really proud by the whole cohort of our students who really took on her approach and her works, and of other writers in the field as well. And I think this has really contributed to very interesting master's theses that later came up. And I should say now this, we have also revised our master's program, and now we have a core debates in political science course as a starter. And this is part of that context. And I should say that this is one of the topics, again, very much appreciated. So this is why when we were organizing this year's webinar, and actually it was Hortense, John, and Erik who came up with the topic, let's put decentering at the center of our webinar this year. And immediately the name came with you, and also Tony Hastrup, Neil, and Louise, and this is how the program was for this year was crafted. So Pinar, thank you for accepting to talk to us this morning, and we all look forward to your presentation and there afterwards an inspiring discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's always nice to hear that your work is read by others, and I'm looking forward to hearing all your thoughts on what you've been discussing so far. Thank you also for the invitation. I'm very happy to be, I'm going to put it in quotation marks here, this morning, joining you, and I'll try and stay on for as long as possible so that I can I'll get to hear about what else is being discussed as part of today's program. So my title is How Not to Decenter European Studies. I'll begin by with two very quick anecdotes. When I initially received this invitation that there is this interest in thinking about decentering European global governance, right? It immediately made me think of a seminar that I attended not too many years ago. I think it was late 2014, early 2015, right? Someone in the audience asked me a question. He probably thought of it as an oxymoron, that whether it was possible to have non-Eurocentric European studies, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's put that aside. That person thought it clearly to be an oxymoron to have non-Eurocentric European studies. Another one, this time it was me asking the question. I asked a very established scholar what he thought of about criticisms of his work regarding Eurocentrism, that some label his work as Eurocentric. And he outright, very straightforwardly, in a very well-meaning manner, told me that he was not Eurocentric, he was just studying Europe. Okay. Again, this was some years ago. I would like to think that it is less easy nowadays to suggest that non-Eurocentric European studies is an oxymoron, right? We have come quite a long way, I think, in the past 5-6 years. You may think that is not enough, right? But there's no denying that there is more of an awareness of the kinds of issues that we're talking about here today compared to 5-6 years ago. So there is this misunderstanding of what Eurocentrism entails, right? It is there, of course, but there is less of that compared to some years ago. By the way, let me just note that Eurocentrism is not in the monopoly of anyone. You can be in the Middle East and be very Eurocentric. When my IR training in Ankara was a very Eurocentric one. Okay, so you can study Europe and seek to decenter it, as you're doing today, right? And then you can study the Middle East and remain to be very Eurocentric. It is not in the monopoly of anyone. It is not the privilege or otherwise of anyone. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to clarify what I understand by Eurocentrism so that you see where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to get to decentering as a method and my preferred approach to decentering. Okay, now I understand Eurocentrism as a particular narrative about Europe and its place in world history, a particular narrative, yeah, emphasis on the particular. So there are different ways of studying Europe, but the narrative, that is the Eurocentric one, is already recognized to be erroneous by many, right? Their mistakes are accepted, right? And non-Eurocentric accounts of world history are available. The problem with the Eurocentric perspective that we have in international relations in the study of world politics is that we have allowed that to shape our research over the years. Right? Even those who are not international historians, right? You may have nothing to do with international history. You may be something very contemporary, but that understanding of history has shaped how we understand states, right? Sovereignty, security, which is my field, right? So that understanding, that particular understanding of international history has shaped the concepts that we use to make sense of other things. That's why Eurocentrism has been a problem for the study of world politics, even for those who are not interested in world history. So we begin with problematizing world history because it has shaped everything else in terms of our conceptual apparatus. Okay, so what I'm going to say at the very big end then is that decentering then is not about turning to study other parts of the world, right? Because Eurocentrism is not only a problem for other parts of the world, okay? It has shaped our understanding of other parts of the world, of course, but it has also shaped our understanding of Europe, right? The very notion of state that we adopt in the study of world politics has problems not only when you take it to Africa, when you take it to Southeast Asia, when you take it to South America, right? It has its problems here as well. Okay, that's why Eurocentrism is a problem for all of us, not only for other parts of the world. Our concepts are developed through a Eurocentric history of world history, right? And then it becomes a problem for all of us. Let me focus on the notion of sovereignty, okay? And one of our key notions. There are now plenty of narratives available on multiple origins of sovereignty. Multiple authors have written about this. I'm not going to look into that at all, right? What I'm going to talk about is my own work on state failure, and then others. I'm going to build on my own work, but talk about others' work as well. The notion of state failure, for instance, is an example of what I'm talking about here, right? The apparent absence of ability to establish sovereignty, to provide security, maintain order in some states, the so-called failed states. The narratives that we have on so-called state failure is that this is about world politics, right? We have IR narratives on state failure, but they're strangely devoid of the international, right? These are IR narratives on state failure, but they are strangely devoid of the international. I'm alluding to not only to the absence of colonialism and neocolonialism here, right? But also not only extraction of resources, etc., but also practices of sovereignty in Europe and non-Europe. That interaction is absent historically and sometimes contemporary as well. Here, let me refer you to Siba Growogi's work, right? He establishes the relationships, well, reminds us of the relationships between not colonial relations per se, right? But international society's differential treatment of states in Europe versus non-Europe. This is an EJIR article from the early 1990s, right? International society's differential treatment of some states in Europe versus others in non-Europe, right? Colonial entanglements are there, but not only that, right? The international society as a whole is a part of what is going on here, not in terms of just direct colonizer-colonized relationships, right? So you have smaller states in Europe whose sovereignty is protected by others for some reason or another, right? There's this intra-European regime of sovereignty that Siba Growogi analyzes in his research. And then there are others in parts of Africa where they do not necessarily these states are not necessarily protected in a similar manner by the international society. Again, not only because of colonization, but the colonization, what colonialism is, of course, the overall context here in terms of shaping international society. So international society's differential treatment of some states in some parts of the world and other states in other parts of the world. So he says, I'm quoting here, right? While one regime, he says, contributed to the resilience of European states, and some of them, he refers to them as quasi-states, another regime in another part of the world, he says, served to undermine the entities in Africa and then allow for them to occur, allow for their failure to occur, right? It's a very interesting analysis that is, again, taking place in the colonialism context, but is not reduced to colonial relations between groups of states. So what he is then saying is that our Eurocentric understandings of sovereignty do not only fail us when we go to Africa or Southeast Asia, right? It also fails us in terms of our understanding of statehood in parts of Europe as well, right? So the challenge of Eurocentrism, the way he tells us about it, is not only the absence of experiences of some, right? Not only absence of experiences of some, but the overwhelming presence of a particular narrative. Not an absence, but the presence of a particular narrative of our connected experiences, but those narratives are not telling us about our connected experiences. Okay. Now, if you approach Eurocentrism this way, right, this is not about the absence of non-Europe in our narratives, right? And that the solution is not about adding non-Europe to our narratives. The solution is decentering, of course, right? But not in terms of adding and stirring others, right? Eurocentrism becomes an epistemic problem for us, and it becomes problematizing the system of knowledge that we have in the study of world politics, okay? So it constricts our understanding of the international, not because non-Europe is missing, but it is incorporated in a particular way, right? Not because it's missing, but already incorporated in a particular way with emphasis on certain dynamics and usually devoid of international connections. Now, there are those of you, I'm sure, who are more attuned to history, right? That are already aware of these dynamics, but let's accept it. Our traditional, more mainstream training in international relations does not always give us such insight. And now, even nowadays, when we are discussing the need for globalizing IR, for instance, decentering international relations, more often than not, Eurocentrism is understood as a problem of geographical location, right? The whole non-Western IR debate sometimes reduces the issue to one of geographical location and attempts to address the problem through adding the perspectives of others, as opposed to my preferred approach is to reflecting on and critiquing the very categories that we have already, right? Not adding, but working with the categories that we have, critiquing them, reflecting on their limitations, right? So you see where I'm going here. I'm critical of one approach to decentering. Otherwise, I am committed to the agenda of decentering, if you're understanding it in terms of Chakrabarty's parochializing or provincializing Europe terms, right? The overall agenda I'm committed to, but I'm critical of one approach to decentering, right? Because I'm concerned here that some approaches may be offering to produce knowledge that's going to close down, occlude the very avenues it's supposed to open, close down the very avenues that it's supposed to open. That approach that I'm critical of, right? And you can see it increasingly being asked in European studies these days as well. That approach seeks to decenter by turning to others and ask, so what do you think, right? So what do you think about this? What do you think about that, right? Right, of course, it's nice to ask others what they think about this and that, right? But I don't think it is helpful in terms of what we are trying to do here, right? Because those questions, those what do you think questions, are interlaced with the assumption that they have not been there all throughout, right? They have not been constitutive of the very things that we're asking about them, right? So what they actually, those questions do is that they leave the center untouched as they're seeking to decenter, right? They leave the center untouched in the attempt to decenter. They leave us with the already existing presumption, let's call it, that the center is the making of the center all by itself, right? Autonomously produced. That center is the making of the center by itself, as opposed to being constituted together, right? Granted, these approaches acknowledge material exploitation between the center and the periphery, Europe, non-Europe. They also acknowledge self-other dynamics between Europe and non-Europe, right? But those are two kinds of interactions, constitutive dynamics between the two, right? Material exploitation and self-other dynamics. What they don't look at is as non-Europe as thinking actors who've always been there, right? Who've also been constitutive of those ideas, practices, and institutions that are otherwise presented to us as autonomously developed, right? So this third constitutive relationship is left out when you ask, so what do you think? So it is not enough. Not only that, but I consider that to be counterproductive. It is counterproductive in the sense that we overlook non-Europe as being there, as having been constitutive of those ideas and institutions that also make up the international, right? What they do is they leave the totalizing conceptions of the international to remain untouched, leaving the center and its understanding of world politics untouched, okay? There are, of course, those who do not leave the center intact, right? They study Europe and non-Europe together by grasping their constitutive connectedness. And those scholars I draw on in my work. And the concept that I find helpful here is the notion of constitutive outside, right? That's what I work with, have been working with most recently. I've draw on David Blaney and Naim Inayatullah's work. This is where I found the notion of constitutive outside. They draw on Stuart Hall, right? But if you're interested, Tim Mitchell's work also makes use of the notion of constitutive outside. In my own work, I've drawn, as I said, mostly on Blaney and Inayatullah. Now, in the notion of constitutive outside, there is a paradox built into it. It's a paradox that we can only acknowledge. We can't, escape it. Only acknowledge and think through this paradox. The paradox here is that some have been left outside of our narratives. They're outside, right? They're outside of the narratives that we find in our textbooks, right? But this is not to be confused with what has transpired in world politics, hence the constitutive aspects of this, right? Having been left outside of narratives is not the same things as how events have transpired. They're outside of our narratives, but their constitutive role can nevertheless be studied. It's just perhaps not to be found in our textbooks. We have to go elsewhere to find it. But being outside and, just being outside of our narratives are not the same thing, right? So that's the paradox there, and that's something that we have to acknowledge and think through it. It's not something that we can escape. And of course, this is not a claim to know what has happened in history, right? That's not a claim at all, and what has really transpired in history. But it's just to acknowledge this paradox. Non-Europe's exclusion from narratives on the modern international is just that, an exclusion from a particular narrative. Right? Remember, I emphasize the particularity of our narratives. So that exclusion is from a particular narrative, and then there are other narratives that are available, and that's what we more often than not try to work with when we can find them. Of course, narratives have consequences, right? And non-Europe's exclusion from our narratives on the international have had their consequences, and that's what we're trying to tackle with in my own work, and that's what I understand you to be doing today as well. So it's that narrative that needs decentering, right? And then our method, as I said, can't be reduced to asking others, so what do you think, as if they have not been constitutive of those very things. I'm going to give you two examples here in terms of constitutive outside. One of them is from Marshall Bayer's work on the absent presence of indigenous people in international relations, right? Marshall Bayer begins with the observation that, right observation, that indigenous people have not been considered to be an appropriate subject matter for international relations. Right? But there's no denying that, right? Our narratives have been about states, and the Westphalian state, indigenous people have not had a place in our narratives. But what he reminds us is that they're not entirely absent from international relations, right? Because theorizing about the state of nature and social contract is shaped by those early encounters with indigenous people, right? And how did we find out about those early encounters? Through European travelogues, right? And non-IR text. So our understanding of state of nature, social contract, IR theorizing already draws on encounters. Remember, connections, constitutive relations. So there is an enduring influence, but we don't always get to hear about this. This is so Bayer actually lays out for us the indigenous people as constitutive outside of international relations. They're nowhere to be found in our textbooks, right? If you suggest that we should study them, people would, you will see people raising their eyebrows, right? Yet at the same time, our critical notions have been shaped by that encounter, and European travelogues writings on that as well. Okay, so those observations may have been erroneous or not, right? That's not the point here. But social contractarian thinking, international relations, owes to those understandings. Correct? Incorrect? That's not the point here. Okay. So what is interesting for our purposes here is this absent presence, right? Constitutive outside. You can also find a similar discussion in Beate Young's work on the invention of the state of nature, if you're interested. And she looks at early encounters in the Americas. The second example is an even more contemporary one. Blaney and Anayatullah look at the dependency school and look at how they have been constitutive outside to critical IR, right? Dependency school as constitutive outside to critical IR. They write, it has been simultaneously, they say, I'm quoting here, cast out of international relations, right? At best, it is the other approach, right? Marxist approaches to international relations at best, right? It's simultaneously, they say, cast out of international relations, but it is also the constitutive other of international relations. Yet at the same time, and I'm very much aware of, we're being in Amsterdam, there's the Amsterdam school, right? Huge influence of dependency school on critical IR thinking as well. There are some of us who are more aware of this and acknowledge this compared to others. So Amsterdam may not necessarily be the best place to say something about the absent presence of the dependency theory, but if you look elsewhere, right? Because we're aware of its formative presence there. But if you look elsewhere, there is very little appreciation of how dependency school has been constitutive of critical IR and its understanding of the modern international. The whole center-periphery approach and decentering actually is based on that to a certain extent, although perhaps not as much as I would like. There's also the web of relationships behind dependency school and more broadly center-periphery approaches. Johan Galtung's, for instance, key text on structural violence was authored in a context of scholarly dialogue with the Kenyan scholar and activist, Ali Mazrui, who was at the time one of the key collaborators of the World Order Models Project. Okay. Enrique Cardozo credited ECLA circles for getting the ideas that are later finding their form in the dependency school. Andre Gunther Frank, right, who contributed to the same debates, also collaborated with Wallerstein. And then Wallerstein, when he's introducing a collection of his essays, credits not only his world system approach colleagues, Frank, Samir Amin, and Giovanni Arrighi, but also peripheral factors and actors, right? He says, he talks about the influence of Fanon, but not only that, right? He says, I started as an Africanist, he says, right? And I was only interested in empirical work at the time, he says, because I thought, he says, theory work was a waste of time. He did not want to do that. Real work for him was empirical work, he said. But he says, and I'm quoting here, I soon became aware that the very tools of analysis were themselves to be questioned. The ones I had been taught seem to be to circumscribe our empirical analyses and distort our interpretations, right? So he's turned from purely empirical work into theoretical work, world system analysis, goes through Africa, right? That's his starting point, to make sense of African dynamics. Again, as I said, he lists Fanon as one of his three influential thinkers. And then it's in the attempt to make sense of the periphery and in interaction with peripheral thinkers that we have Wallerstein. So there you have a sense of the constitutive outside to world systems thinking, dependency theorizing, center periphery thinking as well. Periphery is constitutive of the international, not only in terms of material exploitation, right? It's already there. Not acknowledged as perhaps not as often as we'd like, but it is there more often than not. Not only in terms of self-other relations, right? You find a lot of that in post-structuralist analyses, of course, othering, right? But in terms of learning, and this third aspect of constitutive outside is often not there, right? So I'm distinguishing between three kinds of constitutive relations. Material exploitation, right? Providing bodies and lands whose labor and riches are usurped. Othering, right? Being another to one's self or a foil to one's self. But also as thinking actors who have produced ideas of their own and together with others. This third kind of constitutive relations is often not there, and the very kind of decentering that is suggested, so what do you think, overlooks this third kind of constitutive relationships. Okay, so I'm going to recap. I have one example to talk about, then I'm going to wrap up. I suggested by saying that Eurocentrism is a limitation to the study of world politics, not only when looking beyond Europe, but also within Europe. It's not only about our method to be adopted, can't only be about asking others what they think, right? We need research frameworks, and this is the final point that I'm making today. We need research frameworks that allow us to study center and periphery in Europe and non-Europe in terms of their constitutive connectedness. Right. I already gave 2 examples. Now the final one is drawn from my own research. I use Said's method of contrapuntal reading. He develops it from the 1970s onwards, and there are others in IR who make use of his methods as well. I can think of Gurminder Bambra's work in sociology, for instance. What they do is they're looking at the evolution of what we think of as entirely European autonomous products in connection to other parts of the world. But I'm no historian, right? What I look at is something very contemporary. And this is an article that came out last year. I looked at the 2015 refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, making use of this method of contrapuntal reading by Edward Said, so that we can look at the constitutive relationships there, right? What I do then is to trace 20th century interactions between sending countries, sending geographies, and receiving geographies, not by doing ethnographic work, turning to refugees and ask them what they think, right? Not by doing international sociological work, turning to other scholars in other parts of the world and asking them what they think. What I do is to put different accounts of the same set of events, that is the dynamic relationship between the sending and the receiving geographies, put different texts next to each other and read them together. Okay, so on the one hand, I have the contemporary portrayal of the refugee crisis, right? This happened only a few years ago, so we all have working memories of this. I'm not going to say too much about this, but if you'll recall, in terms of the refugee crisis, there was an attempt to give a humanitarian response to this in the relatively early days. And the humanitarian response that, we've got to be open to accepting refugees, this is the humanitarian thing to do, got criticized from an unexpected place, right, in terms of women's insecurities. The response was to say, of course, we've got to be open to refugees, right, but they're endangering women's security in the European Union. This, I did not see, I was in Denmark at the time, in 2015-16. I did not see this coming, actually, right? Women's insecurities do not always make it to newspaper headlines. And the whole issue of receiving refugees being presented as a threat to women's insecurities was unexpected in that sense as well. Why was this the case? Because refugees were coming from societies that do not always place the same value on women's place in society, women's rights, right? You must remember seeing this in the paper, so I'm not going to provide you with evidence of this, but we can talk about it afterwards. Now, I juxtapose this contemporary portrayal of the refugee crisis and women's insecurities security being endangered by this with Fatma Mernis's writing from the 1990s. On the Cold War dynamics between the same geographies, the sending and the receiving geographies. Mernissi, if you're interested, this came out first in 1995 in Development and Change, and her key concept is palace fundamentalism. What she does in that text is she highlights how what we take for granted as regards the status of women in the societies where the refugees are coming from was also shaped through relations, right? Nothing is pre-given. Those values are also shaped with geopolitical relations between Saudi Arabia and its allies in North America and Western Europe. And the key concerns there are regime security for Saudi Arabia and, protecting the Middle East from the Soviet Union, communism, right? Very Cold War concerns. What happens is Saudi Arabia is allowed to increase its influence throughout the Muslim world in general, and North Africa, East Mediterranean, North Africa in particular, and those societies are shaped as part of this. And the women's status in those societies are shaped as part of this. This is not something that you have from the beginning onwards, but you have a very contemporary geopolitical dynamic building towards the status of women in those societies. So the encounter that is presented to us, and I'm going to conclude here, right? The encounter that is presented to us to be a cultural one, which takes cultures as pre-given as opposed to changing, right, is actually a geopolitical encounter. And not that long ago either, in the Cold War period, okay? So, but what this contrapuntal reading allows me to do is it allows me to see the culturalism of contemporary accounts by juxtaposing it with historical sociological analysis of Marlisi. But what we also see here is that these centering approaches also end up in that culturalist avenue, right? Because they also ask, so what do you think? As opposed to, taking a more historical and historical sociological perspective in terms of these dynamics, right? So these, at the same time, these narratives also are about IR and strangely devoid of the international, right? And they're devoid of the international, even in the most basic sense of state-to-state encounters, let alone other aspects of the international, right? This is why my preferred approach to decentering is one of contrapuntal reading, putting texts next to each other, but the second text is not always easy to find. I know that, right? That second text is not always easy to find, but you'd be surprised how much there is out there when you go looking for it, okay? They're not in our known outlets, definitely not in our textbooks, perhaps not in the journals in the covers of the journals that we're immediately turned to, but they are out there. So it's a matter of finding and reading them together to be able to see the constitutive relations throughout. I'm going to stop here in the interest of time so that I can get a bit of your comments, responses, and questions. I'm happy to open up whatever I may have left untouched or unclear. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinar, for the very, very rich presentation. It is rich as of contextualization. It is rich as of examples and of new perspectives for our methods, for our resources, and the concepts that we are using. So yes, the floor is open for our audience to start discussing. Yes, and of course, thank you for the presentation. Yes, who would like to go first? I do not see everyone. Let me change to gallery, and perhaps you can just unmute yourself for questions if you'd like. Yes, Marijn.
Yeah, let me go ahead. I wanted to give the floor to students, but I'll be the one to ask the first question. Thank you, Pinar, for indeed a very, I think, rich and informative presentation. I learned a lot as well. I just had a question, I think, that perhaps is relevant for students who are preparing also their topics for their master thesis and who are sort of interested in adopting this broader methodology in terms of decentering their approaches. So there's, I think, two questions to this. One is, what would you suggest in terms of how to go about in studying the encounter? So I think, as you very forcefully explained, there is a pitfall in just asking others what they think and what they have thought, so to say. So in terms of approaching sort of the constitutive outsider as a learning actor, or as a sort of participant, I guess, in our learning experience, how should we go about in establishing the encounter or studying this encounter? So yeah, what's the sort of broader, I guess, position that we take in relation to that encounter? And then maybe a bit more practical, I think it was really interesting how you pointed at sort of specific places of where we should go in terms of finding and studying the encounter. So there's the example of the travelogues, there's the broader methodology of the contrapunctual reading, placing texts against each other. There was also the example of working together with, I think, the constitutive outsiders. Would you have specific suggestions for the students in terms of their methodology and the places to go in terms of, finding and constructing this encounter?
Okay, that's not the easiest question to begin with. Thank you. Of course, this is not something that there is a lot of immediate IR work on, right? So we are still building this. I am myself new to it, right? So this is work in progress, right? And at the same time, there have been scholars interested in Edward Said's method of contrapuntal reading for a while now. There is a special issue of the Millennium from the mid-2005, I think. So there is that perhaps to look at. You will find that these connected histories approach is relatively more established in the study of international history. Right? So there is also that. Perhaps less to be found in my own field of security studies. Right, but then there is also Tarak Barkawi's work, who also studies international security in terms of its connections and connected histories. So there's all of that, not that much, but it exists. Of course, I'm more familiar with security studies than any other field, but in terms of political economy, of course, there is Blaney and Inayatullah as well. My late colleague, Lily Link, International Political Economy, we can add to those. Not always explicit making use of contrapuntal reading, right? But these are scholars who've been very much aware of connected histories and in terms of the development of the contemporary problems that we're looking at. How to go about studying the encounter? Perhaps you will think of this as a habit of mine, but I start with how not to do that as well. If we reduce the study to approaching whoever we might want to be looking at as an ethnographical study, right? We're not really approaching what we're interested in as our contemporaries, right? But still as subjects to be studied. Okay. You've already pointed to one method of doing this, which is to work together with others, right? That's one way of doing this. But keep in mind that my own training in international relations in Ankara was a very Eurocentric one. Okay, it's not always. We're not always automatically non-Eurocentric, although we may be located outside of Europe. So it's not, as I said at the very beginning, this is not a geographical location problem, right? It's formative in terms of the training that we receive. It is possible to be aware of these problems located at the center of Western Europe and not be aware of the problems located outside. Right? It's a critical awareness. And what I put more emphasis these days on reflexivity, to be trained to be critical IR scholars, trained in reflexivity, I think is the most important starting point there. So that's where I would start. I would look at these kind of resources that we have in international relations from a critically, right? Look at where they have been produced. This is good old critical IR tradition, isn't it? Historicize, contextualize, but of course, with an eye on the problem of Eurocentrism that exists. Critical IR has its own problems with Eurocentrism, so be very much aware of that as well. And otherwise, I suggest reading very widely outside of international relations, right? Very widely outside of international relations, not anthropology or ethnography, but outside of what I call as known outlets of IR, right? So go for other journals, other publications that are also about world politics, that are also about the international. It's just that we do not always acknowledge them as international relations, as about world politics. And there's a wealth of material to be found there. I came across Mazroui's work on nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation by mistake, right? I shouldn't call it by mistake, by chance I should call it, right? I was looking for something entirely different. And then I found that the notion of critiques of proliferation and non-proliferation as a nuclear apartheid is first voiced by him, and in the 1980s, right? And in not entirely, unknown places. It's just that we do not always know about them. They're not in our textbooks. They're not in our journals, the journals that we're accustomed to reading. That's what I mean by going beyond international relations in terms of the known outlets of international relations, and read them next to the texts that we are used to reading. That's a very lengthy, perhaps you consider it to be a non-answer, but it's just that most of the material that we've got there is not there yet. Right, is not where we would like it to be yet. So we're still producing this, but I have already given you the names of the usual usual suspects in terms of producing this work. You may want to remind me of others that I have forgotten. Of course, I refer to Siba Grovergi's very important work here as well. Rabbi Sholium as well. I'm bound to remember and add to the list as I go on this morning. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question as well. I'm just going to jump in. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very, nice to hear something different than we usually get in terms of political economies and stuff like that. I have several questions, and I'm just going to start with the first one and see how fast I can bring them up. The first one is actually about our understanding that draws on our on European encounters with indigenous people, and it especially the sources we use. And the problem with that is, I believe, is it maintains the narrative. So how do we overcome this problem by using the sources that actually are European in itself? So the fact that we use sources that are described or like use this European perspective also doesn't allow us to bypass or to overcome the problem. So I think that is one critical issue, and I was really curious to hear what you think about that. And my other point is, should we instead not like, why shouldn't we not decenter, or why should we decenter and not develop multiple narratives with multiple centers? And for example, with the Mercator world map, that was one of the first views we had, and then they created multiple maps, and then all of a sudden, like after a little while, then we had this more of accurate view of the world because we developed multiple views. So perhaps shouldn't we develop multiple centers or multiple narratives with multiple centers, and then actually kind of, balance them out in that way, going beyond standard IR narratives. And also, I was really curious to hear what you think about the fact that there is usually a very male-centered, white, heterosexist perspective included in it. And I find as a woman myself, very often, ignored in these perspectives. And I'm really curious to hear how that ties into your research or your view of this broader analysis in the bigger picture. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. 3 questions. Sources. Our sources are European, Eurocentric, how to go beyond this. My answer to this question does not make me any popular, but I insist on giving it nevertheless, right? I insist on saying that this is not about geographical location. It's not about your postcode. Okay. I often allude to my own training in Ankara. It's a very Eurocentric training in international relations, and how I got introduced to the more critical approaches is in Aberystwyth, right? Periphery of the UK, nevertheless. Okay, so it is not about where you are trained. Okay, it's about the critical perspectives, and that may or not may not be ingrained into you. That's why I insist on reflexivity, because we all have our limitations, and there is a constant need to reflect on our limitations. Question number 3, this white male-centered white heterosexist perspective is also related to that as well, right? So critical IR in itself is guilty of Eurocentrism on the one hand, right? And all the adjectives that you have lined up here on the other hand. My late colleague Lily Ling was writing about this. As at the same time, there is the issue of race there. There's the issue of sexism there. There's all of those problems that are built into the very critical perspectives that we turn to as a way out of the limitations of our mainstream perspectives. I recognize that, but you may want to look at her work, Lily Ling's work, in terms of encounters between the West and Asia, her 2000 book. You may find it interesting there. So there's also already a lot of work that draws on post-colonial feminism to look at the the limitations of international relations, and she was very constructive in terms of pointing to ways out as well, not just critique, but pointing to ways out as well. And she's an IPE person also. Anna Agatangelo and Lily has done a lot of work, so you may be interested in those aspects as well. Question number 2: should we decenter or perhaps have multiple narratives with multiple centers? Now, this is the pluralism discussion that we're having these days. You may have already covered this, pluralism in international relations. We had the pluralism dialogue in the 1970s, again in the 1980s. When I was a student in the 1990s, we're having the pluralism dialogue nowadays as well as part of global IR. Pluralism sounds good, right? Multiple narratives with multiple centers, but it leaves, again, the center untouched. And that's where I'm not entirely happy with multiple narratives, with multiple centers. It leaves the stories that we are trained in untouched. And I would like to be able to return to them, critique them, and then take whatever I think is going to push us forward, and then reflect on their limitations as well in terms of the very issues that you have identified for us in terms of being male-centered, white, heterosexist, etc. Right? So I want to be able to reflect on our existing narratives, build on them, right? And then move forward together, as opposed to having different narratives on international relations, living in our own little worlds, and not necessarily acknowledging whatever good and bad that we have produced together, right? I can probably elaborate a little bit on this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just stop here. But thank you for the questions.
It is now time for our roundtable, but I still would like to have Eric's question to perhaps as a linkage point than to continue reflecting on in the discussion through the roundtable, perhaps. Eric, can we still have your question, please?
Thanks, Özlem. Hi, Pinar. Great privilege to have you here. And thanks a lot for Hortense, Özlem, and John for putting together this fascinating masterclass. My question relates to how can we eventually extend this decentering project beyond academia? So considering, for instance, here that most of our students will follow and do careers in policy making, international organizations, private sector. So how can we really extend this project beyond the borders of academia, and how our students, when they apply for jobs or when they pursue different careers, how can they remain critical, self-reflexive, and so on? Thank you very much.
Shall I attempt or just leave it there?
Maybe a very brief answer, and then yeah.
Okay. I've been trained as a critical scholar, and I've been trained, my formative experience is not one of engagement. I'm not an activist, right? By format, but through training students in terms of critical thinking, I engage with practice. So getting my students to start thinking critically and in a connected fashion about every issue that we are studying is the way I engage with the world beyond academia. That's my approach. So, and my thinking is that once this is ingrained into you, once this is built into you, reflexivity, that's something that you're going to take with you. That's my approach. I may be overly optimistic about this, and I acknowledge that, but that's the only way I know of in terms of reaching beyond academia. But this is a great question. This is something I perhaps need to formulate a little bit further thinking on. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for the question, and I thank you, Pinar, for the answer. I think this is a very good finishing point for the keynote of this webinar. And now I hand over the moderation to John for the roundtable. And sorry to have taken a couple of minutes.